Dreams and Symbols in Jane Eyre by Ashi, Melanie, and Josh Herring. Jane's artistic abilities reflect her imagination and immersion into a different world. As she is almost constantly suppressed by an authority figure in nearly all stages of her life, her desires, hopes, and imagination are reflected through her artwork. Jane says to Mr. Rochester, quote, "As I saw them with the spiritual eye, before I attempted to embody them, they were striking. But my hand would not second my fancy, and in each case it had wrought out but a pale portrait of the thing I had conceived." End quote. Her subconscious mind is not in correlation with her reality. Rather than being known as an imaginative woman who has great depth in her thoughts, she is simply known as a plain, middle-class woman in her community. Dreams in Jane Eyre also serve as presentiments for events to come in Jane's life. Her dreams are often followed by unfortunate events. For instance, Jane recalls, quote, "For during the past week scarcely a night had gone over my couch that had not brought with it a dream of an infant." End quote. Soon after, she receives the news that John has killed himself and that Mrs. Reed is on her deathbed. Later, she has a strange dream in which she carries a crying baby across a path with Mr. Rochester long ahead on the road. She describes this to Mr. Rochester as a, quote, "strange, regretful consciousness of some barrier dividing them." End quote. The barrier symbolizes Bertha Mason, Mr. Rochester's mentally ill wife. In Jane's other dream, she witnesses the destruction of Thornfield while being burdened by a baby once again. When she climbs a wall in an attempt to see Mr. Rochester, the baby climbs onto her neck and almost strangles her. Later in the story, Thornfield does in fact burn down. Perhaps the most important presentiment of all was when Jane hears Mr. Rochester calling for her even though they are a number of miles away from each other. She senses that he is in distress and immediately returns to him. It is this connection between the two that allows their new life as husband and wife to begin. These premonitions reflect the inner conflict Jane has with herself and add depth to her character. It is important to notice that in all three instances, a child in the dream symbolizes impending obstacles in Jane's life. Jane also dreams of Blanche Ingram closing Thornfield's gates on her after marrying Mr. Rochester. This reflects her unhappiness about the prospect of Mr. Rochester marrying Blanche. In another instance, she dreams of a heavenly figure telling her to run away from Thornfield and, quote, "flee temptation." Her dream reflects her inner uncertainty about her marriage with Mr. Rochester, as she believes that it will bring a new stage in her life. Omens also play a major role in the progression of the novel. For instance, the rain in the garden after Mr. Rochester proposed to Jane symbolized a cleansing of Jane's old life and a beginning of a new marital life. However, in this case, rain plays a double role as a symbol of the sadness that is to come in their future relationship. Therefore, her dreams reflect her innermost desires, presentiments, and omens of future events. One of such cases is the instance of the chestnut tree. The chestnut tree first appears after Jane meets Mr. Rochester for the first time, when she walks back to Thornfield after witnessing the gentleman sprain his ankle after falling off his horse onto a path. The strong tree foreshadows that their relationship to come will become stronger. The splitting of the chestnut tree is perhaps one of the most significant events in the novel. It foreshadows the discrepancies Jane will face in her relationship with Mr. Rochester. The garden in which Jane first confesses her love to Mr. Rochester is described as Eden-like, and so the splitting of the tree becomes a bad omen in so holy a place, especially since this becomes the focal point of their relationship. Therefore, the symbolism of the tree foreshadows the fact that their love in the future will weaken and decay, almost like the chestnut tree did. The greenery and the landscape play a significant role in establishing the tone and mood of certain scenes of the novel. However, this is not the only function the scenery achieves, as it also helps in foreshadowing events as well as shaping one's characterization of Jane through her emotions. For instance, weather is used to create an eerie atmosphere in the Red Room. This can be evidenced by the description of the room by Jane, who states that, quote, "It was past 4 o'clock, and the beclouded afternoon was tending to a drear twilight. I heard the rain still beating continuously on the staircase window, and the wind howling in the grove behind the hall. I grew by degrees cold as a stone, and then my courage sank." End quote. Here the landscape seems to heighten her sense of fear and loneliness. This atmosphere also foreshadows Jane's horrific experience when she feels a presence in the room. Later, when she arrives at Lowood, the author creates an atmosphere of optimism and a sense of freedom, as Jane will eventually prosper in her studies under Miss Temple's care. Jane describes this as such, quote, "April advanced to May. A bright, serene May it was. Days of blue sky, placid sunshine, and soft western or southern gales filled up its duration. and now vegetation matured with vigor. Low wood shook loose its tresses, it became all green, all flowery. Its great elm, ash, and oak skeletons were restored to majestic life." End quote. When Jane arrives at Thornfield, there seems to be an almost melancholy, depressing mood, foreshadowing the emptiness of the manor and Mr. Rochester's lonely life. Thornfield is a place, quote, "whose best winter delights lay in its utter solitude and leafless repose. If a breath of air stirred, it made no sound her. Far and wide on each side there was only field, where no cattle, no browse, and the little brown birds which stirred occasionally in the hedge, looking like single russet leaves that had forgotten to drop." End quote. Helen Burns is one of the most obvious Christ figures in the novel. She fits many of the characteristics of a Christ figure, such as forgiving others, bringing hope into a sinful world, undergoing physical and mental abuse, dying at a young age, having a follower such as Jane, being accepting of all people and believing in the idea of loving your enemies, still being unmarried, sharing her plethora of wisdom and knowledge with others willing to listen, accepting her fate and life, accepting the unjust punishments she almost constantly faces. In this way, Helen Burns represents a Christ figure in Jane Eyre. There also exist similarities between Charlotte Bronte's life and Jane Eyre's life. Some of these similarities include the fact that in both circumstances they both had a mother who passed away when they were young and a father who was a poor clergyman. Neither was considered to be beautiful. Both were eventually taken care of by their aunts. Both were sent away to school where they were children, the directors of which were cruel, pain, and strict. The school provided minimum resources such as food and water. There was a disease outbreak in both instances that killed many pupils. Both grew up to be governesses and teachers, and both women eventually fell in love with their employers. Jane fell in love with Mr. Rochester, and Charlotte Bronte fell in love with Constantine Heger, the director of her school.